Everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 31st of December, final day of the year. I can't believe that 2022 is almost over. This war is almost a year old. That's just crazy. And with the end of the year, there's no end in sight to the war. And so this is going to go into 2023. Who even knows if it will end by 2023? Maybe it will go on even longer. But anyway, let's talk about the here and now. And there's a lot that's happened since my last video 3 days ago. I was going to upload last night, but there's even more updates that happened in between last night and today, which is about afternoon, December 31st Eastern Time. So let's first talk about the Kherson front, where there are finally some updates. Then go into Zaporizhia, and then I want to talk about Bakhmut. I also want to mention Luhansk, not in this video because there's so much that I need to unpack over there. So I will probably mention it in a totally different video that I might upload tonight or maybe tomorrow. But I do want to mention that in its own video because I have a lot to say about it and I don't want to make this video too long. And so let's first start out with the situation in Kherson, where in recent days we've seen some Ukrainian strikes. Maybe they're not strikes, maybe they're sabotage on the city of Henichesk. This is the new regional capital of Kherson, recognized by Russia, and so a lot of the administrative work is being done in this city. It's also connected to Crimea, so a lot of the supplies coming in from Crimea, they first go to here, pass through the airport, and so there was some sort of explosion over here that caused some panic with the locals. It might have been an ammo depot that went off, but yeah, I just know that the Ukrainians have their eyes on Henichesk, specifically because of a lot of the administrative buildings over there and a lot of the ammo depots, and so it's being hit pretty hard. Now, on to some frontline news. The Russians have apparently taken over Potemkin Island, which is this island over here. Let me go over the perimeter. You can see this is Potemkin Island. And so we've been hearing a lot about this island for really now a month. Ever since the Russians withdrew from Kherson, there was a bit of a gray zone in between the Ukrainian lines that they set up around the city of Kherson and some of the nearby towns that were just adjacent to the Dnipro River. And so you can see that they had positions for artillery, for spotters, for snipers all around the coast, but that they didn't actually land on a lot of these islands that have. Some of them have residential areas, some of them have resorts, some of them have harbors, but they're very, very dangerous to land on without proper air support, proper artillery support. And so it was difficult for Ukraine to land on some of these islands that are near reservoirs that are very low in elevation. A lot of these are just on the floodplain. And so it is difficult to set up positions over here, which is why it was a bit of a gray zone. The Russians, they withdrew from these islands as well for a lot of time. They were just trying to set up new defensive positions, get their defensive lines ready, setting up trenches, vehicle revetments, stuff like that, and regrouping their forces. And so that's what they did after they withdrew from Kherson. But once the fighting really dissipated and it appeared as if the Ukrainians were not going to make an effort to actually probe the lines and advance deeper into Kherson, the Russians, they started sending their special force units onto some of these islands. They did this in very small groups because when you're on these boats, when you're on these low elevation floodplains, it is very easy to get spotted and attacked by artillery, and there's not much cover. And so yeah, they did this in small groups, usually at night. And I think that this really started around December 8th, December 9th, when the Russians originally landed on Potemkin Island. They took over the southern part over here. This was confirmed by Ukrainian sources, and there are actually some pretty large residential blocks over here, but again, they're all vacant right now. You just have Russians positioned in here. And so over the past few weeks, they've been going on and off, just launching some probing attacks, and they finally took over the island 2 days ago, which was confirmed by both Russian and Ukrainian sources, that they were able to take full control of the island without any Ukrainian resistance. So now they're going to set up their four positions on this island, and that's not really going to materialize into anything at the moment. It's just giving them a better buffer and just better positions in order to prevent a Ukrainian attack, because really at the moment it's unrealistic to expect the Russians, with their really little forces on the Kherson front, to launch any sort of offensives across the river. Most of the Russian forces in Kherson have been moved elsewhere, mostly to Bakhmut or to Donetsk, those fronts. And the Ukrainians, same thing with them. They've moved most of their units to Bakhmut. I'm going to get into that later on in the video, but that means that the Kherson front will be quiet for a very long time. So for that reason, I don't have much to say about it. Same thing goes with Zaporizhia. There's not much going on over here. There's just one little thing that I want to mention, just about troop rotations. So we have a new unit that was moved into the Zaporizhia front a few days ago. It is the 108th Detached Territorial Defense Brigade. Basically, what's going on is Ukraine is moving some of their more battle-hardened, stronger forces to the Bakhmut front or to other areas along the front line where there's a lot of heavy fighting, and then to fill the void. And many territorial defense units into Zaporizhia, mainly to the Orikhiv sector around Molotokmachka, also to Hulyapilske, and then of course to Hulyapoli, where you have the 124th Detached Territorial Defense Brigade, and now will be reinforced by the 108th, which is now stationed around Vasilivske. And you can see there's a warehouse over here, so they'll probably have barracks set up over there, and they'll be dispersed to the front line accordingly from there. Now, the point of this is not to launch any sort of offensive, because really all Ukrainian offensive plans were put on hold after the situation in Bakhmut got very tense and the possibility of an encirclement became a possibility. And so now they're just trying to hold the line, and that can be done with these territorial defense units, many of whom have just been recently mobilized, many of them actually being mobilized from the territories that Ukraine took back in Kharkiv or from Kherson. And so they've had about a month of training, and now they're just being moved in to hold the line. And it's not like the Russians are going to be launching any sort of major offensives here either, because they're mainly focused on Donbass, and they're not really looking towards launching major offensives anymore. At this point, they've really shifted towards a strategy of attritional warfare, where they really fix the Ukrainians in one position and try to diminish their manpower, equipment, their capabilities. So that's really what they've been doing. And in Zaporizhia, really, at this point, the Russians are just trying to fortify, because Zaporizhia is probably the least fortified part of the Russian defensive line. Kherson is pretty fortified. Luhansk is pretty fortified. In Donbass, there isn't really a possibility for a Ukrainian offensive, so it really just leaves Zaporizhia as the only area that's open, and so you're seeing the Russians starting to construct defensive lines over here. Now, we did actually see some localized Russian advances in this area. So yesterday it was reported that the Russians were launching offensive operations just to the west of this town over here called Dorozhyanka, and at the time, I had marked this town under Russian control, and so based upon those reports that Russia was trying to capture the town, I changed it to Ukrainian control, which is something that probably happened in the intermediary months between my first making of this map and the localized changes. But anyway, the Ukrainians, they saw the situation and they tried to contain the localized Russian advance, so they sent in the 59th Motorized Brigade, and I think it was specifically the 16th Battalion, and so that unit was really sent in to hold the line over here, prevent the Russians from flanking the town and from reaching Zaliznichny. And so Russia has not really made any attempts at advancing along this road to Zaliznichny, but today in the morning it was announced that they had retaken Dorozhyanka, which was apparently a gray zone, so you didn't have either Russian or Ukrainian troops in the town, but now you have Russian troops taking it over, which gives them positions that are pretty close to Hulyapoli. Hulyapoli is one of the main defensive hubs of the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia. It's connected to a vast network of Ukrainian military complexes here and chains of command, and so it is a pretty important city, and it does open the gateways to a lot of different roads going north, east, and west. And so to take Hulyapoli, there are 3 different roads that the Russians now have control over, although I don't see this happening really anytime soon. it does put Huliapoli in a more difficult situation than it was before. But again, as I said, situation remains stable over here. Now, moving on to the more interesting part of the front line, I want to talk about the situation in Bakhmut. We're going to start our way with Ozaryanivka and work our way up to the north, Soledar. So in Ozaryanivka, we've had Ukrainian units hitting the Russian troop concentrations in Ozaryanivka pretty heavily over the past few weeks. So a lot of the Russian command, a lot of military equipment has been moved to Ozaryanivka recently, so it could be closer to the front line around Klishchivka. As a result, Ukrainian artillery has taken advantage of this to hit their positions over here. You have the 55th Artillery Brigade, which has moved in from Zaporizhia to this part of the front line. I'm estimating that a lot of their batteries around Dilivka, and they're firing to the southeast over here. Although they probably do have some artillery batteries dispersed all around the front line, perhaps in Bilahora, perhaps in Toretsk, Shumi, Pivdenie, all these different towns. Then obviously you have the 113th Territorial Defensive Brigade, which has also been firing heavily on Ozaryanivka. So yeah, we have a lot of video footage of Ukrainians hitting Russian targets over here. Apparently the 55th Artillery Brigade hit the Russian barracks with Caesars, and so these are self-propelled, and they have 155 millimeter shells, so you could see those landing on the Russian fortifications, the Russian positions over here. But this is not really an effort to take back Ozaryanivka, because there have been attempts previously by Ukraine to cross over the canal and take Ozaryanivka, and they have not proven fruitful. For now, it's just to contain the Russian advance and destroy a lot of the equipment and a lot of the troops before they're able to make it to Klishchivka. In Klishchivka, the Wagner Group actually posted a very important and informative map showing all of the units involved in the Battle of Bakhmut that they're going up against. And I have no reason not to believe them, because it doesn't really... The only propaganda purpose of it would be to show that Wagner's outnumbered, but they didn't give any specific numbers for Ukrainian troop concentration, and so it doesn't have that much propaganda value. In reality, it just seems like there are a lot of Ukrainian units that were moved in to hold the line, and that they are fighting mostly Wagner Group, but also some DPR in Russian units, for the most part Wagner Group. So it might be trying, Wagner may be trying to just brag about the fact that they're taking on so many Ukrainian units at once. Either way, I have no reason not to believe their map, and so I adjusted my map accordingly based on what they said. So in their map, they have 3 different units housed in Klishchivka trying to hold the line. You have the 60th Separate Infantry Brigade, 95th Air Assault Brigade, and the 28th Mechanized Brigade. And so they have been fighting very heavily, and they've been able to prevent a major breakthrough by the Russians. But in recent days, the Russians have been able to clear out the tree lines that are leading to Klishchivka. A lot of these roads over here that are potentially going to be used by Russian infantry fighting vehicles to enter the town, those have been cleared now. But a head-on assault on to Klishchivka would be very difficult because of the entrenched Ukrainian troops over here. They have obviously concrete bunkers set up within their residential areas, and so just launching a head-on assault is going to be very difficult and will lead to a lot of casualties, which is why the Russians, they instead try to flank Klishchivka from the north. They were able to take over some of these positions in these either agricultural areas, maybe there are orchards. There's a quarry over here that they took over. So using these positions, they were able to take over nearby heights, and using this hill, they were able to overlook the Ukrainian positions on the rail station, and fired mortars and snipers were stationed on the heights to attack the Ukrainian positions. So at this point, the train station is probably just a gray zone. The Russians may have taken it over already. There are pro-Russia maps that show that the train station is under Russian control. If it finally is, then it will give them an opportunity to either attack the town from the north, or they can try to solidify control of the flanks by going in, crossing the rail line, and attacking the Ukrainian fortifications from the north as well. Now, this is not the only flanking maneuver that the Russians are doing over here. They have taken over a lot of the agricultural and just like open fields to the south of Bakhmut, and in the process, they have rapidly approached the main rail line, which could be used to just outflank Klishchivka and attack Ivanivske head on, which is the town which connects Chasiv Yar to Bakhmut. So you could potentially see this maneuver. I guess the issue would be that the Ukrainians have troop concentrations to the south and to the north, and so it could be sort of a trap, and they could be attacked from both sides, which is why what I see as more likely is that the Russians are trying to just gain favorable positions south of Bakhmut so they can have a foothold in the south of Bakhmut, and then this would really make Ukrainian fortifications and defensive lines around the Bakhmutovka River null, because they would be attacked from the south and their lines would just be redundant at that point because they would not be able to account for the Russian advances in the south. And so this is what you could potentially see happen. If the Ukrainians are fully pushed back towards the Bakhmutovka River, you could see the Russian garrison in Opytne and in southern parts of Bakhmut attack and flank them before they're able to withdraw, perhaps even taking over the road that leads towards Ivanivske, and then you could potentially see a cauldron develop. And so that's what the Russians are trying to shape right now. They're trying to shape the battlefield to their advantage, and the Ukrainians have seen this, and so they've been forced to withdraw from some of these areas. So, for instance, the Ukrainians have been forced to withdraw from some of these dachas over here, these resort houses, some of these orchards, some of these quarries, and now there are even some maps, specifically military maps, which is a pro-Russia map, but it has some pretty good sources, and it is very cautious when making different declarations or announcements about Russian advances. It shows that the front line looks more like this, where the Russians have a foothold in some of the residential streets in southern Bakhmut, and that they're actively attacking this residential warehouse, not this residential warehouse, this agricultural warehouse over here. And that's certainly possible. What we do know is that this is probably just a gray zone at this point, and that Ukraine has been forced to withdraw towards some positions around this parking lot, around the cemetery, around this local park and school. In this area, there are many Ukrainian units. I don't know specifically which ones are stationed in southern Bakhmut versus like eastern Bakhmut, but I do know that in general, based on the Wagner map, there are about, say, 20 units, including brigades and battalions, that are stationed in and around Bakhmut. So you have, for instance, 61st Jaeger Brigade, 58th Motorized Brigade, and this is just to give you some perspective. There are just so many. I can't go through all of them, but you can see here on the map, you could click through at each one just to see how many are defending, especially the territorial defense units, by the way. Many of them have been sent in from Kharkiv, just like in Zaporizhia, to hold the line over here. The situation is even more dire in Opytne, where the town is basically fully under Russian control now. So we know this because 2 days ago, the Russians released some drone footage showing that the Ukrainians were trying to go on the counterattack. And you can see that their positions, where the tank was driving, was around this road over here, and that it was actively fighting around this gas station, which is really on the border between the city of Bakhmut itself and the suburb of Opytne. And you could see how the counterattack was defeated, and that Ukraine really only had 9 more buildings under their control in Opytne. They were pretty large buildings, I would say maybe like 5 stories high, and in those buildings Ukraine obviously had infantry, small arms fire, they had anti-tank equipment just set up over there to hold out for as long as possible. So let me just show that to you guys over here. You can see that there are about 9 houses, maybe these houses included as well. That's like 3, 6, 9. Yeah, about 9 houses where the Ukrainians were fortified. But eventually the Wagner group was able to push them out. It took about a day or two. And now Opytne is fully under Wagner group's control. Now, this does not mean that the battles over here are over, because in the southern part of Bakhmut, you have the Sobachivka district. And so this is, again, a very dense district, just like Opytne, just on a larger scale. And so the Ukrainians are still holding onto their positions in this district. They're not withdrawing from southern Bakhmut. They now have fortifications, or trying to set up fortifications in the forested area over here, in some of these larger buildings that you can see over here that I'm going over with my cursor. And then obviously you have the residential blocks where there are many Ukrainian troops stationed. You have specifically in this sector the 63rd Mechanized Brigade, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, and the 71st Jaeger Brigade. And so they're tasked with preventing the Ukrainians, preventing the Russians from advancing deeper in. Because now, with the Wagner Group having momentum on their side, they could potentially try to advance onto the Bakhmut Dam and try to cut off the Ukrainian groupings that are fighting to the east of the Bakhmutovka River, that are trying to hold the line over there to prevent a full-scale retreat from the city. And so the Ukrainians in this part of northern Opytne, they were under heavy encirclement. They were almost enveloped. And I talked about this beforehand because they were being attacked actively from Ivanohrad. They were being attacked, obviously, from the south. And in recent days, they were also starting to be attacked from the east over here, because the Russians, they were gaining control of some of the open agricultural areas, the orchards to the north of Klishchivka. And so using these new positions, they were able to launch attacks onto the eastern parts and from the eastern flank. And this really left only one area open for Ukraine to retreat from. And before being encircled, they just wanted to maintain their troops and be able to create a more solid defense line. So that's why they were forced to retreat to this more stable line over here. They did give up the first really dense part of Bakhmut, though, and so this could be used as a springboard later on, as I discussed. But let's move on again to the situation a bit further north. In the industrial sector, not much changed, and really the real changes happened in this forested area over here. So previously the Russians had control of most of this forested area, but the Georgian Legion and other different volunteer units from like United States and from the UK, all these different foreign units, they were instrumental in pushing the Russians out. And there's also some geolocated videos from here that you can see of Russian equipment being struck in the area along the highway on the outskirts of the forest. But it seems like now the Russians have been able to retake their positions in the forest, and there's some pretty gruesome videos of fighting in the forest. Now, the residential areas have not been taken yet on the eastern portion of Bakhmut. Most of this area is under the jurisdiction of the Miaskombinat district. So let me zoom out for a second to show that. The Miaskombinat district is really this northern part over here, if I'm not mistaken, just to the west of the forest. And so the Russians have now started to gain a foothold in this district because they took over some of these residential blocks that are next to this gas station just to the north of the forest. Some pro-Russian maps, like military maps, they show that the Russians have expanded their control very deep into the district and that they're very close to the Bakhmutovka River. They have their maps looking a bit like this, where there's a bulge in the open fields in between different residential blocks that is very close to the Bakhmutovka River. But this is probably not true. In reality, there might be some areas that are really a gray zone, but that the Russians don't have full control over. And so that's probably what military maps is referring to. But again, this does give the Russians new forward positions, and it clears out one of the most difficult areas on the outskirts of Bakhmut, because the Ukrainians have been fighting tooth and nail in that forest for a very long time, and some of their best units were in that area, like the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade and some very small units that have some pretty sophisticated Western equipment and that are tasked with their with different like destruction and reconnaissance operations. So let me give an example. You have the Scala Intelligence Battalion that was fighting in the forest. They were using their positions in the forest to fire onto the art winery and the industrial district. Now they've been pushed out. And so again, shaping the battlefield, giving Russia better positions. Same thing is going on in Pitarodny, where the Russians have taken over in recent days some of Ukraine's firing positions on the outskirts of Pitarodny. The Wagner Group map says that the 17th Tank Brigade and the 115th Separate Mechanized Brigade are stationed in Pitarodny. So you can see that there are some pretty sizable units trying to hold onto here, because if the town falls, then this could put the Bakhmut supply lines in peril. Let me show an example. This is one of the only supply routes still flowing into Bakhmut. You can see that it's coming in from the north. You have this turn over here, and then you have these turns over here. So if Pidhorodny falls, this puts the Russians in a very good positions to shell this road and to potentially take over these supply routes, these rail lines, and prevent any sort of reinforcements or resupply from coming in, and just severing communication. And so that's part of Russia's strategy of developing a cauldron, like they did in Severodonetsk or in Lysychansk. And so that's why the Ukrainians are fighting tooth and nail in Pidhorodny. It's not fallen yet. The Russians have not entered the town yet, but they do have positions just to the south of it. They've also been able to take full control of the road that is supposed to connect Soledar and Bakhmut. They also took control of some different, like, isolated warehouses and reservoirs that are connected to the road. And using these positions, they can now begin to attack Krasnohora. Krasnohora is very fortified. You have some Ukrainian fortifications around Krasnohora that I have mapped out, and you can see that the Russians have recently announced fighting in the vicinity of Krasnohora for the first time, which implies that the Russians have been able to start probing the Ukrainian line over here. Although it would be difficult to break into Krasnohora, it would significantly disrupt the Ukrainian supply lines if the town could be taken, and it could also put Soledar under threat, because Soledar would then be flanked from basically three sides, because it's already being attacked from the south, having the 25th Airborne Brigade, the 24th Mechanized Brigade, the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, and the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade defending. And then from this part, the fighting to the east of Soledar, there's also the opportunity for Soledar to be flanked, because in recent days, the Wagner Group and the 10th Guards Motor Rifle Division have expanded their control, taking some open fields, taking some forest belts, reaching this little pond over here. And this puts the Ukrainian groupings in this specific tree patch under threat, because they're basically enveloped from three sides. So I would expect them to withdraw from here very quickly before they get encircled and destroyed. It also puts the Ukrainian formations in the industrial part of Soledar under threat. This is one of the most fortified parts of Soledar, one of the most fortified parts of Donbass. And so if it gets flanked like that, it could put the Ukrainian positions on the front line in danger if it is taken over. Then obviously you have the situation in Rozdolivka, where Ukrainian units have recently been sent in to hold the line and prevent a breakthrough, because Rozdolivka is also important. If Rozdolivka falls, the Russians will have control of one of the roads that is leading to supplies to Soledar, and also by extension to Bakhmut, but that's to a lesser extent. And so now Ukraine is trying to hold on to Rozdolivka, also trying to hold on to Vesele, which is being attacked obviously frontally with Russian convoys trying to traverse the open fields to reach Vesele. They've not taken over the town yet. It's being defended by the 118th Cherkasy Defense Brigade, and the situation is not good for them, because they are pretty isolated from the main Ukrainian logistical lines, but nonetheless they've been able to hold on for now. All in all, the situation has been more favorable to the Russians in recent days. The question of whether they're going to be able to fully overrun the Ukrainian positions is something that only time will tell. But it does seem like they're now able to shape the battlefield in a way that we haven't really seen for a long time. They've been able to make some pretty significant gains, and so I expect the battles here to just continue at a steady pace, where the Russians just continue to make these minimal gains, trying to chip away at the Ukrainian positions, and eventually find a way to squeeze them out of the city without incurring that large of a casualty toll. But either way, I hope this was useful, and thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later.